On the afternoon of December 15, 1969, 20-year-old Carol Blades dropped off a load of laundry at the small laundromat in Nixa, Missouri, and was never seen alive again. By that evening, her car was found abandoned on the shoulder of US 160, just outside of town, with the engine blown, the windshield muddy, and the rear antenna bent. As her husband, Larry, began frantically calling around to family members to find out where she was, a crime scene was unfolding 12 miles from Carol's car, and the scene would remain undiscovered for an entire year. Neva Carol Blades was born on July 8, 1949, and as a child, she moved around quite a bit with her family before finally settling in Nixa, a quiet little town in the Ozarks of southwest Missouri in Christian County. Carol was described as a shy and quiet individual with a very sweet side. When she was still a teenager, she married Larry Blades, and by the winter of 1969, they were planning to start a family together and had looked into adoption. While she worked as a cosmetologist, Larry worked the overnight shift at a manufacturing plant in nearby Springfield. By all accounts, they were living a happy and fulfilling life. That is, until Monday, December 15, 1969, about a week and a half before Christmas. Early that morning, Larry had arrived home from his overnight shift and went straight to bed. Carol, meanwhile, went Christmas shopping at the Kmart in Springfield, where one of her closest friends, Linda Rabe, ran into her. Linda would later say that Carol had mentioned she still needed to do laundry, then get back home in time to wake Larry up for his overnight shift. After Kmart, Carol drove the few miles back to Nixa and stopped at her usual laundromat. She put a load of clothes into a washing machine, and then what happened in the moments immediately following that has remained a mystery for over 56 years. Most theorize that Carol was abducted from the laundromat not long after starting the washer. Before that, most of her movements were very well documented based on witness testimony. First, she was seen at the local grocery store buying a box of cookies at 2:30 p.m. that day. She then arrived at the laundromat 25 minutes later. Then at 3:45 p.m., not even an hour after arriving at the laundromat, Larry was awoken by the home phone ringing. He tried to reach it, but the caller only let it ring once before hanging up. Theorists online have suggested this phone call may have been her abductor or an accomplice testing the house to see if Larry was awake and home alone. I don't typically give my opinion on these cases, but I have serious issues with this theory. If the abductor or abductors were trying to find out if Larry was there and called the house and received no answer, why didn't they show up? I personally think it was just a random call from someone, maybe even a wrong number. Plus, witnesses saw a man abandoning her car at 3:30 p.m., 15 minutes before that call ever came through. The phone call was most likely from someone local who remembered at the last second that Larry was likely sleeping because of his night shift and quickly hung up. I suspect it was probably the same person who called back at 6:45 p.m., which was a local woman calling to ask if Carol and Larry were going to help with the town's Christmas parade floats. Remember, it was a very small town of only 800 people, and everybody really did know everyone. When Larry answered the 6:45 p.m. call and noticed the time, he was immediately concerned and asked the lady on the phone if she had seen Carol around town, but she hadn't. Sensing something was wrong because Carol was very routine, he called Carol's cousin, Sue Horton, and asked her to drive over to the laundromat to check on her. Sue lived right near the laundromat, and Carol often stopped in to visit while waiting for her clothes to finish. But that day, she never came by. When Sue arrived at the laundromat, she found Carol's clothes still in the washer, but she and her car were nowhere to be found. So Sue drove out along US 160 looking for her, and that's where she found Carol's car. The 1965 Chevy Impala was pulled onto the shoulder of the highway north of Nixa, about a quarter mile from the laundromat. The engine was blown, and the windshield was muddy. It was clear that whoever drove the car had severely abused it, and a massive black puddle of motor oil was discovered right in the gravel beneath where the car was parked. It wasn't just a leak. The engine had actually blown a gasket or a line, which caused oil to splatter across the interior firewall of the engine block, eventually causing it to seize up and die. Once again, though, Carol was nowhere to be found. 3 days later, investigators would find the car keys in a small field about 100 feet away. Unfortunately, the investigation was led by Christian County Sheriff L.E. Lamb, who went by Buff, a very abrasive individual with extreme tunnel vision. It's safe to say he was not a good detective. He immediately theorized that Carol had run off with another man, a theory that he refused to let go of. He even told Larry that he felt the two of them had probably been fighting and that Carol had simply gone home to her parents in Oklahoma. However, none of this was true, and her family begged him to investigate it as a missing person, but he'd already made up his mind. On the day Carol disappeared, at around 3:30 p.m., 3 different motorists had been driving along US 160 and saw something strange. They saw Carol's car pulled over on the shoulder of the road, and they saw a man getting out of the passenger side. The man started running across the open field toward the laundromat. When he realized at least one of the 3 witnesses was watching him, he lifted his coat up over his head to hide his face. As he ran into a grove of trees, a low branch caught the coat and pulled it down, and for a brief moment, those witnesses got a clear look at him. They described him as a white man in his late 20s or early 30s, around 5 feet 9 or 10 inches tall, with a dark complexion and black hair combed back. A police sketch was put together from their description, and in a town of only 800 people, this should have been all the investigators needed. What happened to the evidence after that has haunted Carol's family for half a century. Carol's car was towed to the Christian County Courthouse parking lot, where, according to her brother Rob Horton, it was left unlocked for days. Passers-by actually walked up to it and wrote, "Wash me," in the dust on the windows, unaware they were touching a piece of evidence in a murder investigation. Fingerprinting was also delayed, and by the time anyone got serious about processing the vehicle, it had already been contaminated by deputies, family members, and curious onlookers. Rob, who would later spend years working in law enforcement himself in Dade and Greene counties, told the Associated Press that Buff Lamb was, in his words, either really stupid about evidence or he was protecting somebody. The evidence in the case, including the sketch of the man from the field, would then go strangely missing from the sheriff's office, which only adds to the suspicions that Buff was protecting someone. Carol's family actually had a suspect in mind, a local man who owned 3 businesses in town, and according to Carol's mother, Geraldine Horton, he matched the sketch perfectly. The Missouri State Highway Patrol was brought in to assist in the case, and had allegedly administered a polygraph exam to the businessman, and he allegedly failed. When Geraldine brought this to Buff's attention, he brushed it off, saying he had only failed because he couldn't read or write. While polygraphs can be inaccurate and are not admissible in court, they still have nothing to do with reading or writing. So once again, it left many to wonder, why was Buff trying so hard not to solve this case? Well, that's because he was convinced that if Carol had met with foul play and not run off like he actually suspected, then it must be Larry. His claims were also suspicious about the businessman's ability to read and write, which would pose a significant issue to a man trying to run multiple businesses. Because of this, Geraldine and many others believe Buff straight up lied, but to this day, it's unclear why. For more than a year, Carol's family waited and searched and pushed for answers, and then on Christmas Day, 1970, they got the news they'd been dreading all along. A Stone County farmer named Mr. Garner was walking his 200 acres, looking for stray cattle. His property sat just south of Nixa, near the small community of Ponce de Leon, about 12 miles from where Carol had vanished. In a grove of cedar trees on a remote stretch of that farm, he found a human skull and the scattered skeletal remains of a young woman. The Stone County Sheriff was called out, as was the Christian County Sheriff. Dental records confirmed what Carol's family had already suspected for a year, that the remains were Carol's. And then the way her family learned about it would stay with them forever. Larry was eating Christmas dinner with his sister and the rest of his family when the phone rang. His sister answered and handed Larry the receiver. On the other end was Sheriff Buff Lamb. According to Larry, he said, "Well, Larry, this is Buff. I think we found your wife's remains. You'd better come on over to Adam's funeral home." That, Larry would later tell reporters, was the way he was notified that his 21-year-old wife had been found dead on Christmas Day. No one was sent to the house, no grief counselor, no chaplain, no deputy. Just a phone call from the sheriff, who had no business being in the position in the first place. The condition of Carol's remains made determining a cause of death essentially impossible. After a year exposed to the Missouri elements, what was left of Carol was just skeletal. To this day, if a cause of death has been determined or theorized, it's never been publicly released. Buff continued to lead the case, and according to Geraldine, continued to focus on Larry. She said Buff had told her that he believed Larry was responsible and that he was going to give him enough rope to hang himself. Larry, however, voluntarily took and passed 2 separate polygraph tests, and with no help from Buff, was eventually cleared as a suspect. By the time it was all over, Carol's family said the sheriff's office had thrown them out of meetings, made Geraldine cry in his office on more than one occasion, and dismissed leads they were begging them to investigate. Due to the lackluster investigation and Buff's refusal to take anything seriously, other than pointing the finger at Larry, many began suggesting that he himself was somehow involved, either in the crime or at least in covering for someone. However, Buff denied any involvement publicly in a 1980 newsleader interview, and he died in 2001 without ever being charged. The American Legion post in Nixa collected nearly 700 signatures on a petition asking for a grand jury to be convened, but the petition went nowhere. Here's the most prominent theory based on the location of the laundromat, her body, and where her car was found. Carol was likely abducted at the laundromat, forced into her car, and driven 12 miles out to that remote Stone County farmland. After committing the murder, the killer faced a massive problem. He was stuck out in the middle of nowhere with a missing woman's highly recognizable vehicle. In a frantic panic, he drove the Chevy Impala back toward Nixa, planning to dump it somewhere to throw the police off. But he drove it entirely too hard. Just as he reached the northbound edge of town at 3:30 p.m., the engine blew, leaving him stranded on the side of the road in front of passing witnesses. In a panic, he ditched the car, threw the keys, and took off running southeast across the open field, sprinting straight back toward the downtown area. If we consider the businessman as a suspect, it's possible he was heading back toward the safety of his own Nixa storefronts. In the decades since, the case has been picked back up more than once. In 2010, around the 40-year anniversary, Christian County Sheriff Joey Kyle publicly said he wanted to bring the case back to the prosecutor's office for a fresh look. But unfortunately, most of the original physical evidence was either mishandled, contaminated, or lost. If you or anyone you know has information regarding the murder of Carol Blades, please call the Christian County Sheriff's Office at 417-582-6203. Carol was found murdered on December 25, 1970, and as of June 2026, this case remains unsolved. At about 6:30 in the evening on Sunday, March 15, 1964, 12-year-old Mary Theresa Simpson said goodbye to her cousin and started walking home in Elmira, New York. She was last seen by a friend a short time later, standing in front of a store at the corner of East Market and Harriet Streets. She told that friend she was heading home, but tragically, she never made it. 4 days later, a man hiking with his 2 sons through a wooded area off Combs Hill Road in Southport, on the outskirts of Elmira, would find her body partially concealed beneath dirt, tree branches, and large stones. It would then take 62 years and a sample of DNA from a man who had been dead for more than 2 decades to confirm who killed her. Mary Theresa Simpson was born in 1951 in Elmira, New York, to Ellsworth and Rose Simpson, and grew up around an older brother, an older sister, and an older half-brother. Mary was, by every account from those who knew her, a quiet, shy, well-behaved girl. After her parents separated in May of 1963, Mary lived with her father. In late 1963, the two of them moved to nearby Hammondsport, where her father had taken work, but they came back to Elmira in early March of 1964 when he found a new job in town. Sadly, she had only been back in Elmira for a couple of weeks when she disappeared. On the afternoon of Sunday, March 15, 1964, Mary left her father's apartment around 3 p.m., telling him she was going to visit her cousin. What she didn't tell her father was that she was actually going to see her mother first. She likely left that part out because she didn't want to create friction or conflict at home. She spent about an hour at her mother's house, then left to go to her cousin's. Around 6:30 in the evening, she said goodbye and started for home. Sometime around 7 p.m., a friend saw her standing in front of a store near East Market and Harriet Streets. That would be the last confirmed sighting of Mary alive. Around 11 p.m. that night, when she failed to return home, her father called the Elmira Police Department and reported her missing. Unfortunately, in 1964, the police weren't initially alarmed by the missing persons report. However, within 3 days of her disappearance, police were openly suspecting foul play. Multiple searches were performed, including vacant buildings, abandoned homes, and junkyards. They also notified other police departments across both New York and Pennsylvania. On March 19th, 4 days after Mary went missing, a man hiking with his two sons through a wooded area off Combs Hill Road in Southport, southwest of Elmira, came across her body. She was fully clothed, but had been covered with dirt, leaves, tree branches, and large stones, and dirt and twigs had been stuffed in her mouth. An autopsy determined she had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. Through the spring and summer of 1964, Elmira police questioned dozens of men as tips came in from across the region. By October of that year, they had questioned roughly 300 suspects. The local radio station WELM and the Star-Gazette newspaper jointly raised a $1,000 reward fund for any information that might lead to an arrest, and in 1972, that reward was increased to $5,000. However, none of it produced an arrest. The killer of Mary Theresa Simpson, whoever he was, had simply walked away from the woods on Combs Hill Road, and no witness or suspect had ever been able to put a name to him. As time passed, the case grew cold, but thankfully they were able to preserve physical evidence from the crime scene, including Mary's clothes. In 2003, as DNA technology was advancing rapidly, the New York State Police Forensic Investigation Center retested some of the original evidence. A cutting from Mary's skirt tested positive for DNA that was left behind after the killer sexually assaulted her. Investigators were then able to extract a DNA profile from it, and that profile was entered into CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. However, it did not match any known offender. The DNA was resubmitted to CODIS in 2014, but again, no match. The breakthrough finally came when investigators turned from CODIS to a different technology. In 2022, the Elmira Police Department received a grant from the nonprofit Season of Justice to help solve Mary's case. The following year, they partnered with Othram, a Texas-based forensic genetic genealogy laboratory, and with students from the Criminal Investigation Resource Center at Russell Sage College to conduct a genealogical analysis using the DNA from Mary's skirt. By 2025, the genealogical work had pointed investigators toward a name that had never appeared in the original 1964 investigation. That name was Alfred R. Murray, Jr., a former resident of Elmira who had died in 2004. To confirm the genealogical match, investigators collected a DNA sample from Murray's adult son. The son's DNA confirmed that his father's DNA was a likely match to the DNA found on Mary's skirt. Investigators were not able to find any connection between Mary and Murray, leading them to believe it was likely a crime of opportunity. On February 10, 2026, the Elmira Police Department held a press conference and announced that after almost 62 years, they had identified Mary's killer as Alfred Murray, Jr., officially closing the case.